Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll just note that the book is co-authored with my colleague Richard Freeman in the economics department at Harvard, and Douglas Kruse, my colleague in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. So after he was elected President of the United States, George Washington faced a very interesting dilemma. The cod fishing industry was the fourth largest export of the colonies before the American Revolution. And you may not realize this, but dried cod in barrels was a world commodity at the time with a world price. And the colonies here exported that. It was their fourth largest export, mainly to Europe, because the Pope said the Christians shouldn't eat meat on Friday. So they had a huge market, and as you know, there's huge cod fisheries off the coast of Newfoundland and New England. The British, in order to conduct not just military warfare but economic warfare, did everything they could to destroy the cod fishery during the Revolution. They arrested sailors from the ships. They destroyed the ships. They burned the ports. They burned the storage facilities. And they really attempted to destroy the industry. And they were pretty successful. So when Washington became president, he realized that one of the things he needed to do for an almost bankrupt group that had just won the revolution was get that industry back on its feet. So he turned to the Secretary of State. You know, at the time, there was just a Secretary of War, a Secretary of State, and a Secretary of the Treasury, so it was not a very big government. So he turned to Thomas Jefferson, just returned from France, Secretary of State, and Jefferson was negotiating cod fishing rights with the British as part of the resolution of the Revolution. And he asked Jefferson to see what he could do to help bring the industry back. Jefferson, and you can Google Jefferson's report on the American fisheries. Jefferson wrote it all with his own hand. He had a research assistant, Secretary of the Treasury Thomas Alexander Hamilton's Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Tench Cox, famous political economist at the time, was Jefferson's research assistant. And Jefferson did a huge period of research on the cod fishery. And at the time, he asked his research assistant to find out everything you can about this fishery. And so they went to a gentleman, Mr. Josephs, who was at the time the biggest shipper, the biggest, in our day would be the biggest billionaire of shipping in Philadelphia, and said, "What do you know about the cod fishery?" And Mr. Josephs said, and you'll see his letter to Thomas Jefferson in the report, he said, "Well, they send out ships to get cod. Sometimes they pay workers on a fixed wage, no matter what they catch. But oftentimes they pay them a share of the performance of the ship. And when they pay them a share, the productivity and performance of the ship is always better." Jefferson stored that in his brain. Subsequently, President Washington decided that they would provide what we would consider today to be tax credits or tax incentives to any ship that went out. Well, they then received a letter from the owners of cod ships. And they said in this letter, basically, send the check to us. Just give us these tax credits, we'll take care of the rest. However, there had been a custom for over 150 years of broad-based profit sharing on the catch, as you have heard from Mr. Josephs. And so there were a lot of objections about this, and the senator from Massachusetts at the time, Senator Cabot, he introduced a piece of legislation which said that the shippers could receive tax credits only if they signed a document before the ship went out saying that there would be broad-based profit sharing for all sailors on the ship on the entire catch. And not only that, the tax credits would be distributed over 60% to the crew and 40% to the shippers. So this was the first time in American history that inclusive capitalism, whatever you want to call it, broad-based employee equity, broad-based profit sharing, was included in a law and made a condition for receiving tax credits. And we'll come back to this story later, but it's a really interesting story. I discovered it in the 7 years I spent writing this book. It's now has its own little piece in the Oxford American Encyclopedia of American History, and it's really my favorite story. This book is really a book of American historical stories. I did the research on the American history at the Institute for Advanced Study, School of Historical Studies, 7 years ago this spring. So I'm going to make 4 points today. First point is that democracy requires broad-based ownership. In chapter 1 of the book, I show that the founders of the American Republic believed that the best plan for the Republic was to have broad-based property ownership. They actually believed that you couldn't have a democratic republic exist without broad-based property ownership, because that would give you feudalism, which they had just rebelled against. Their main policy to deal with economic and wealth inequality was in fact broadening property ownership. It wasn't redistribution. They were obviously not socialists or communists. Such things didn't exist. My second point is that U.S. wealth inequality is in fact from the concentration of capital ownership and capital income. I'm going to demonstrate that current wealth and income inequality we have is mainly driven by lack of diffuse and broad-based property ownership, not mainly by the inequality in wages, which is obviously an issue. My third point today is that therefore a critical solution to this makes sense if the cause is concentrated capital ownership and capital income. Then one solution we should consider is ways to broaden capital ownership and capital income in the economy. And I'm going to talk about broad-based employee equity, forms of employee ownership, broad-based stock option, grants of restricted stock, broad-based gain sharing, profit sharing as a way to do this in the economy. But I'm also going to talk about the notion that a lot of people don't actually work in workplaces for-profit corporations in our economy. Namely, they are teachers, they work in nonprofits, they work with little children, they're in the military, and so forth. So we need to figure out a way for citizen trusts to have dividend income to receive supplements to their wages. My last point is going to be that the internet can perhaps be a useful, disruptive informational tool dealing with this issue of wealth inequality. Now, chapter 1 of the book talks about the fact that broad-based ownership is necessary for a republic. And I'm going to read you just a little quote from George Washington that opens the book. In the first place, it is a point conceded that America, under an efficient government, will be the most favorable country of any kind in the world for persons of industry and frugality, possessed of moderate capital, he's referring to the middle class, to inhabit. It is also believed that it will not be less advantageous to the happiness of the lowest class of people because of the equal distribution of property. What was Washington talking about? He was talking about the notion that there would be sufficient land for every family to be economically independent by having a farm. Not every family to be rich, but to have a certain level of economic liberty and independence. President John Adams pushed broad-based property ownership when he was in Massachusetts, and he wrote, "The only possible way of preserving equal liberty is to make the acquisition of land easy to every member of society." In fact, you might not know this, but after the American Revolution, when John Adams was drafting the Constitution of the new state of Massachusetts, a number of his colleagues suggested changing the name of the state of Massachusetts, of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to Oceania, after British political theorist's political treatise by James Harrington called Oceania, which was a utopian society where there was broad-based property ownership that helped preserve liberty. That's how much they were thinking about this issue. President Thomas Jefferson made it a major theme of his writings. He said that legislators cannot invent too many ways to subdivide property. And he didn't mean redistribution, taking your property and giving it to me. What he meant was opportunities to acquire property to every citizen. When Jefferson drafted the Virginia Constitution, he wanted there to be a part where every citizen, and unfortunately we have to mention that at this time there was a constricted definition of citizenship, the evil of slavery, and the also terrible evil of the social exclusion of women from civil society had not been addressed, and one can't escape from these terrible evils. But even though these and other founders disagreed on these issues, they all did agree that broad-based property ownership was necessary for economic liberty. James Madison, later president, he developed some criteria for laws to maintain broad-based property ownership. And he wrote, "The U.S. have a precious advantage also in the actual distribution of property and in the universal hope of acquiring property." So let's be clear. Their view was that land was the major capital of the time, and in order to have a republic, you had to have broad-based, although not completely equal or egalitarian ownership of land. Madison, and we're going to come back to this later, he expected that it was possible that the country would run out of land to make every person, every citizen, every household economically independent. So he had some ideas to how to address that, and we'll talk about this again at the end of the talk. He said the federal government should withhold unnecessary opportunities from the few, which would increase inequality of property. He said without violating the laws of property, in other words, without redistribution, reduce extreme wealth towards mediocrity, he means the middle class, and raise extreme indigence to a state of comfort, and abstain from measures that favor one interest. I'm going to show you at the end of this talk that the federal government violates virtually every one of Madison's criteria and how we can apply his criteria to some reform. Now, this just wasn't some kind of a political ideology. They took very strong steps very quickly, and they were maintained over about 100 years to implement this broad-based property ownership. They quickly outlawed primogeniture. Those who've watched Downton Abbey know what I'm talking about. Jefferson drafted a liberal policy for land shares as Secretary of State for Washington, which allowed sales of land, sales of public land that could be provided to families and households at reasonable prices. I should also point out that at the Constitutional Convention, they forced many of the states who were holding large amounts of public land to yield that land to the federal government so it could be made available to citizens. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, they abolished slavery and servitude in that entire area of what later became Ohio, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and a third of Minnesota. And they said that that land would be available for citizen farmers. Jefferson did the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon in 1803 mainly to, as he said, effect an empire of liberty, to allow a lot of land to be available for independent farms. And this, we're talking about here, 600 million acres. So you can see the actions that they took to effectuate this policy were really significant and big actions. Until 1862, almost 75 years later, liberal land policies were a major part of U.S. policy. There was constantly a debate between the Treasury Department and the rest of the federal government over, should we sell land to the highest bidder? People are rich, they can buy land at high prices, or should we make it available at installments, at low interest rates, at low prices to the middle class? And that second part of the argument always won out. And it was very much like the ESOP that I'm going to talk about later, where today workers in a company can set up a workers' trust, borrow money, and through installments from the company's profits and revenues, pay off the stock that the trust buys, and the workers become owners. Okay? Citizens continuously favored shares, property shares, over selling land to deal with the budget deficit. So if the Tea Party has any question about where initial Americans landed on that issue, it's very clear from the historical record. Land shares were central, as I show in Chapter 1, to the founding of the Republican Party. founding of the Republican Party, which ran on an anti-slavery platform. John Fremont, free soil, free labor, and Fremont was his motto. Okay? President Lincoln spoke very strongly in terms of this notion of broad-based property ownership, and he attempted to right the wrong of the evil of slavery with the Homestead Act, which provided initially 160 acres to a family that did some sweat equity, built a structure. Later on, there were a variety of homestead acts in different states, and in parts of the United States where it took, say, 640 acres to support a family with economic independence, the acreage was increased. However, and the Homestead Act, again, was an example of really big actual attempts to implement this policy of broad-based property ownership. The Homestead Act dealt with 20% of all public land and 10% of the landmass of the United States. Imagine if with these kinds of property resources we were to implement their policy today, and you're going to see some very comprehensive recommendations at the end of my talk to do just that. However, in 1829, James Madison, after his presidency, was at the Virginia Constitutional Convention, and he said, you know what, can we really sustain this? So he took out, I say an envelope, he took out a piece of paper and he projected how much land there would be by 1930, what the population would be. He divided one into the other and he said, you know what, we can't do it. There won't be enough land to sustain a homestead for every family. And then he wrote that this is the most serious problem that we have to solve in the future, and we have to figure out new ways of ownership. Well, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Galusha Grow, who was often called the father of the Republican Party, an anti-slavery Republican congressperson from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he wrote, after he managed the Homestead Act for President Lincoln through the Congress, that we are out of land, and the future of this idea is profit shares and equity shares in corporations, because corporations have unlimited assets. And this idea was picked up. So in the late 1800s, a number of very rich business people who were also impacted by the Christian social gospel and by ethics and morality from their own religious backgrounds, they came forward with the Grow idea. And leading figures worked very hard to figure out ways to create broad-based property ownership in the context of corporations. And this book, as I said, is mainly a book of stories. In chapter 1, I tell the story about the founders. In chapter 4, we tell the story about all these business people. I'll just comment on a few of them. So George Pillsbury, he had the largest grain mill for flour in the entire world. And actually, at one point, his mill burned down. And he remembered that. He said, you know what, I want every worker walking the floors of the mill to worry about, flour dust in grain mills. If there's a spark, you know what happens. And so he introduced profit sharing. It's really interesting. Pillsbury became world renowned for his profit sharing plan. William Cooper Proctor was sent by his daddy here to Princeton University to study in the early 1880s. And Proctor went back home after hearing in his political economy lecture about broad-based profit sharing, broad-based employee stock ownership, and how that was a continuation of the founders' idea, and he implemented it in Procter & Gamble, which, by the way, today is about 20 to 25% worker-owned. Okay, so you can remember that if you brush with Crest toothpaste and use Bounty paper towels. Okay, and then we have Andrew Carnegie, who made terrible errors in his fights with steel unions by trying to tamp down their wages, but at the end of his life wrote a book saying that this idea was a continuation of the founders' broad-based property ownership is necessary for democracy idea, and he envisioned federal tax incentives to encourage employee stock ownership and profit sharing. And George Eastman, by the way, I think very important to Google, because he probably invented the broad-based stock option that many Googlers have received. As you know, Eastman Kodak was the high-tech go-go company of its day. And when I was up in Rochester going through the archives of Mr. Eastman, I came upon a really great letter, which I could imagine could be written to one of the Google founders. The letter said, "Dear Mr. Eastman, I'm a holder of a lot of Kodak stock. And it really bothers me because Eastman, when he had a shareholder meeting, he would talk about the broad-based stock option and the employee ownership and the profit-sharing plan. He had all three of them. It really bothers me how much equity you're granting to workers. You're giving them my money. And Eastman, I found his letter on that onion paper that they used in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Okay, his carbon copy that his secretary saved. And Eastman wrote him back, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. He said, "Dear X, I remember you. You were one of the initial investors in Kodak. You're sitting on your 600-acre horse farm in New England because of all the money made by the innovations and the knowledge and the technical insights of Kodak employees. And we provided them a share of the ownership so they would be so innovative. You know what? Go to hell." That basically is the response that he sent. Okay. Interesting issue that happened is in the 1920 election, William Cooper Proctor decided to run a presidential candidate actually on a platform to save capitalism by introducing these ideas. You can read the story in the book. There's a lot of scandal involved in that story. Not on the side of Mr. Proctor, who was a pretty pure soul. There was a lot of research at the time on these ideas suggesting that they were leading to higher productivity and higher employee engagement. Not going to go into them in a lot of detail. Now, I've talked already about the kinds of shares that we're discussing. We're discussing grants of equity shares, as in restricted stock grants, employee stock ownership plans, which, by the way, workers do not buy with their savings, and company matching grants to 401k contributions. I am against, and the co-authors of the book are against, the middle-class worker buying huge amount of shares in their own company with their savings because it's too risky. But grants of shares, grants of equity is something that we're for. As you know, they're lower risk. Grants of stock options are lower risk if you don't buy them with your savings. And certainly cash or deferred profit sharing and cash gain sharing for team or departmental performance is also very, very low risk. How many shares are there in the United States? Well, as part of the extensive empirical research we did on the book, it was historical research, but it also involved contracting with the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center to do a nationwide survey, actually 6 nationwide surveys. This is the center that does research for the US Census on contract. And we found that about 17% of adult workers own stock in their firm, about 19 million. About 9% hold stock options, so that's more than executives, right? There's only 5,000 stock market companies with 20,000 top 5 executives. So stock options, as you have and have had in Google, are pretty ubiquitous, at least among 9%. About a third receive profit shares, and every year about 6% of the US working population does receive stock options. We found that about 50%, exactly about 48% of all adult workers receive some combination of these. And in tech companies, often they receive a combination of all of them. Now the problem is that the average dollar value of many of these plans is pretty modest and pretty small, except in the most generous companies. But the good part of this is, if you were to say that broad-based equity and profit shares would be a possible solution to solve inequality, the mechanisms to do that are already there. Companies are familiar with these mechanisms, and they're pretty common in the United States. By the way, more common than in Europe, and more common than in Asia. Now I'm going to skip through this slide. What are the share sectors? Basically, among the 5,000 stock market companies, about 20% of the Fortune 100, and you see their Fortune 500 ranking there, have either broad-based equity or profit sharing. Recently, Southwest Airlines, just to give an example, distributed 30% of all of its cash profits, from the floor sweeper up to the CEO of the company, and you see Google's name up there. About half of the companies that win the 100 Best Company to Work For in America competition by Fortune magazine have inclusive capitalism. Among leading high-tech companies, well, I have a book on this with my colleague Doug Kruse and Businessweek former associate editor Aaron Bernstein called In the Company of Owners about how this plays out in tech companies. Among the 100 largest privately held companies like Cargill, Fidelity, Bloomberg, Wegmans here in New York, which has cash profit sharing, we see a lot of these kinds of things. And for example, those of you who've been to Florida and Georgia and the South, public supermarkets 100% owned by its employees. So in chapter 2 of the book, we show that the idea that you could have a lot of broad-based profit sharing and broad-based employee stock ownership and options in the economy is demonstrated by many of these cases. Many that we don't hear about because they're not in the newspaper a lot are closely held companies in the privately held sector. There are about 10 million workers in about 10,000 ESOPs. As I mentioned, an ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan where a company sets up a trust. The trust borrows money to buy stock for workers, and then the trust distributes the stock to workers. Workers do not have to put up their house as collateral, and they receive the stock as a grant. You might ask yourself, where did 10 million workers, $1 trillion in market value, and 10,000 ESOPs come from? Well, if any of you, like I am, had a family business in your family, you know that the worst thing with the family business is when there isn't a son or daughter to take over. And so what happens is family businesses are now selling the business to the workers and managers who built the business. The entrepreneur takes the cash, goes buy their condo in Southern California or Boca Raton. Okay. And we have this among entrepreneurial startups. And in the United States, the purest version of this, only about 400 worker co-ops with 3,000 to 7,000 persons nationwide. Okay, now, I'm going to go on for a few more minutes, and then we'll stop for questions. Certainly, employee ownership has failed in American history. In the 1800s, a lot of trade unions tried to set up pure worker co-ops, and they were against hiring professional management, and many of them failed for that reason, although some of them did succeed. Some unions, when they were faced with the closure of a factory or a company, they gave concessions, salary, benefit, work rule concessions for stock. They implemented the idea in a company on its last breath. That was not a good idea. United Airlines, you've heard, had an ESOP. Well, actually, it wasn't really an ESOP. It was a union concession situation. The workers of United traded reduced wages, reduced benefits, increased work hours, and more changes in work rules for stock. It was implemented in a company where labor and management just hated each other. It was an important failure. It was not an ESOP where workers received grants of stock financed with credit. Heavy concentration of workers being pushed and manipulated to buy stock in their companies. Enron, WorldCom, Lehman Brothers, we know where that went. Some tech startups and non-tech startups fail. Entrepreneurial companies have a high rate of failure. You're one that succeeded. Okay. Now, I'm just going to talk about this briefly. One of the things that we do in the book, even though it's mainly a book of historical stories and a history, American history of shares, is we talk about a review of about 100 years of hard-nosed empirical research using major data sets on this question. I just want to comment on two. At the National Bureau of Economic Research, we received about $1 million from the Russell Sage and the Rockefeller Foundations to study intensively how workers respond to inclusive capitalism, with about 41,000 workers in 14 firms, including large and small, tech and non-tech, stock market, and privately held firms. And we generally found that workers with more share plans and above the median percent of their pay in shares exhibited lower turnover, greater loyalty, made more suggestions, were more willing to work hard and innovate, and they were more willing to co-monitor their fellow workers. This worked best when there was a combination with high-performance work practices, such as high training of workers, low supervision, not too close supervision, teams, and job security. When you had this combination, absenteeism went down. So I'm going to ask if you could pass around this chart, and you can see how much turnover decreased in this research. Now, when we did this research, we had to ask ourselves, under what conditions does broad-based capitalism really just bomb? Okay, and we know what those conditions are. You can see them in bold at the bottom there. When workers are paid below market wages, there's not enough equity and profit sharing you can throw at them to motivate them, okay? It just washes out all the positive effects. When workers have too much risk in their personal economic situation, same thing. And when you have high and too close supervision, right? You try to do this kind of a workplace and you have the kind of supervision that Henry Ford had in his factories in the 1920s, not gonna work. Now, a second study I want to comment on briefly. Our first study was kind of challenged because obviously we were looking at 41,000 workers in 14 companies. It was not a random sample. Although I should mention that we commissioned a national survey of all the adult workers, again, from the University of Chicago and the General Social Survey, and we were able to replicate our regression analysis with that. But Eric Maskin, who, as you know, later received the Nobel Prize in Economics, was the respondent on this paper. And he said, you know what, I would believe these results if you gave me many, many more workers, many, many more companies, and other than a worker-supplied report measure on expected turnover. So I asked myself, where can we find such a huge data set in the United States? And it is, in fact, the data set of the Great Place to Work Institute that puts together the scoring for Fortune magazine for the 100 Best Company to Work For contest. Using the data set of 305,000 random worker surveys at the applicants, both the winners and the losers from 2005 to 2007, and over 1,300 applicant corporations, we were able to replicate the findings from the earlier National Bureau for Economic Research study. This was funded by the Sloan Foundation. And now I'm going to conclude in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll stop for questions. By the way, bless you. I'm not going to read through this slide other than to say that the big sector of pure worker ownership in the United States is, in fact, ESOPs. As I said, about 10,000 ESOPs, about 10 million workers, about $1 trillion in market value, mostly in companies with under 500 employees. In general, we find higher productivity when you have this proper corporate culture of high training, teams, not low supervision. We also found that these companies where a worker trust is set up that buys stock and then pays off that stock from the revenues of the company, they have, on those loans, they have a very, very low default rate. And we found that workers in these companies generally are paid above market. Because you wouldn't want to develop inclusive capitalism if workers' wages were cut so they could receive stock and profit share. It would be a bad idea. So why should we care about wealth shares? And if you could pass around the next two handouts, I would appreciate that. The reason to care about shares is wealth inequality. As you know, it's the main economic and domestic policy issue today. Inequality is mainly about capital income and capital ownership being concentrated. So inflation-adjusted wages have been relatively flat since 1880. Globalization, the decline of unions, many things have contributed to this. The top 1% of households control a third of all wealth. The top 10% control 75% of all wealth and more than 80% of financial assets. And you can see from this chart in front of you called Capital Income Highly Concentrated from the Brookings Institution Tax Policy Center that the top 20% of households receive 86% of all capital gains and all capital income. I've passed out another chart showing, adjusted for inflation, how the income, after-tax income, when you take into account the poor who receive transfer payments and the rich who paid more taxes, when you take everything into account, I've passed out another chart showing, it says summary figure 1, how incomes grew between 1979 and 2007. It's been updated to 2010. And the top 1% income growth has been something on the range of around 250%. And you can see for the quintiles of the middle classes, it's just been pretty bad, really horrible. Capital income to the top 1% recently went from a third of all capital income in 1979 to 3/5 in 2005. Now, the federal government has, in recent times, unlike those really comprehensive policies at the beginning of our history, always got this wrong. Okay? What is the main way that the federal government encourages workers to have employee stock ownership in their companies? Buying company stock in 401k plans with their wages. Okay? That's too risky. It's too risky, and the middle class doesn't have enough extra money to buy enough capital ownership. Why would we have a system, as the federal government now has designed for us, where those who have capability for the lowest amount of risk and have more wealth, in other words, top executives in companies, right? They have access to the lowest risk forms of employee ownership, grants of restricted stock and stock options, where the middle class that has less wealth and less appetite for risk is encouraged through the 401k laws to buy more risk with their wages. The first George Bush and the Clinton administration, without going into detail, eliminated a large number of tax incentives for stock market companies to do big employee stock ownership plans. Every major financial services, Wall Street Bank in New York in the late 80s and the early 1990s had a employee ownership division. You may not want to believe this, but it's true, to try to develop this in companies until Bush and Clinton destroyed these tax incentives. The last President Bush, through a series of policies, eliminated incentives for broad-based stock options. And an interesting story is the Clinton-Gore reform on executive pay, which said that companies could only deduct $1 million, up to $1 million in fixed pay for their top 5 executives. What did they do? As it went through Congress, they added that the deductions for top 5 executives for employee stock ownership, equity, and profit share related pay would be unlimited, just for the top 5, okay? You know how much that costs? It costs you, the taxpayer, $5 to $10 billion a year in tax incentives. In other words, you are subsidizing executive pay at all 5,000 public companies. $5 to $10 billion a year. You know what the total tax incentives for broad-based employee stock ownership plans are in the United States? $1 billion. So federal policy is all messed up here. To conclude, what we would like to see to move more towards broad-based capitalism is follow the founders' principles, those points of James Madison I mentioned in the beginning. Public corporations can only deduct executive equity and profit sharing plans if they have a broad-based share plan for all their employees. By the way, Google would qualify, okay? All businesses can only receive the $1 trillion in corporate tax incentives that get given out every 5 years if they have a broad-based share plan for all their employees. To fix the Bush mistake, there would be a special tax credit for firms that have broad-based stock option and stock granting plans, as you have here. There would be a special tax credit for these firms. For workers in not-for-profit companies, we have to figure out a way to deal with that, and I would recommend that we look to the Alaska Permanent Corporation. The Alaska Permanent Corporation gets money from leasing oil and natural resources fields and access to oil and resource companies, puts it in a fund, and then invests it and pays a dividend to every citizen of Alaska. What I'd like to see is the federal government set up a piece of legislation to encourage in states and localities and cities around the country there to be similar kinds of corporations that would use various kinds of assets, the wireless spectrum. These corporations would own solar energy and wind energy farms. They might take ownership of various parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, as I said, and other kinds of assets. They would get lower interest loans and tax incentives, and they would provide dividend payments to citizens. Because as I've established, and as the evidence has established, the middle class is going to decline because their wages adjusted for inflation are flat or going down. Unless we directly address the concentration of capital ownership and capital income, we're not going to be able to deal with this issue. Finally, Can the internet disrupt wealth inequality? Remember, it was supposed to strengthen democracy, but the internet has had very little impact on the concentration of capital ownership and capital income. The concentration of capital ownership and capital gains and capital income. Wealth and income inequality during the same period the internet has grown have gotten worse every year in the United States. The internet has failed to deal with this issue. One possibility would be a shares app that could pull data from SEC filings on the extent of stock market company share plans, Department of Labor filings on the extent of ESOPs, and employee surveys on the extent of their equity and profit sharing plans that every citizen could get to. We should brainstorm others. If you want to read chapter 1, you can go to our website, thecitizenshare.com, or you can follow my comments on Twitter. Delighted to be with you today. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take your questions and discussion. Yes.
These days, whenever the subject of inequality comes up, one pretty much automatically has to talk about Piketty. You seem to be talking about methods for essentially getting more capital to flow to the people at the low end. Piketty's solution seems to be to add friction to the ability, through taxes and such, to add friction to the ability to accumulate large quantities of capital. Can you talk at all about sort of the difference between your approach and Piketty's and what you think of Piketty and what Piketty might think of you? Or not you, but I mean the work.
Yeah, well, if you, don't worry about that. If you see the paperback, Thomas Piketty's opinion about the book is on the top of the front cover, so I'll let him speak for himself. We met in Paris last February, just before he came to the United States. But I will comment on his work. First of all, I think that Thomas Piketty's work has created a big focus on wealth and income inequality like there has never been. And despite the debate, and by the way, I think that he is on solid ground with his results. The Census, the Congressional Budget Office, and many other sources support his results for the United States concentration of wealth and income inequality. As to his solution, yes, his solution would be called a redistribution, because what he would like to do is have high income taxes for the wealthy in the 60, 70, 80% range, plus a modest tax on all wealth assets. So high tax on annual income and a modest 1 to 2% tax on all wealth. The rich would have to file a report on their wealth. I will make two comments. First of all, if one applied the broad-based property ownership approach of the founders of the American Revolution and some of the suggestions that we're talking about, one could address this in a different way by broadening property ownership. And I think the stark choice that we have is between redistribution, broad-based property ownership attempts that we're talking about, and feudalism, right? At the time of the American Revolution, the British aristocracy controlled 80% of all land in England. And you can see the numbers that I showed you. Those are US government numbers, Census, Congressional Budget Office. We were approaching or surpassing that. James Madison and others of the founders at the Constitutional Convention worried about this. And for those who have spent their time attacking Piketty, I will say, go and read the Constitutional Convention book, and you will see that they said, if we can't continue to maintain broad-based property ownership, there will be calls for redistribution in a democratic system. The majority that will be disenfranchised will vote for higher taxes. So I think that that's a problem, and probably we're going to see a lot more conflict over this issue in the future, unless the Republican and the Democratic Party, both of which seem to be bereft of any real ideas other than lies on this issue, right? The Republicans want you to think that every few years they can give you a $1,500 tax cut and it's going to solve wealth inequality. And the Democrats want you to think that they can give you the minimum wage and health care and it will solve wealth inequality. Both are just stark lies. If we don't deal with broad-based property ownership, I think there will be calls for greater taxes on wealth and income, although these things will be very, very hard to implement. Okay? Did I answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay, well, come back to me.
Maybe if I could, a mechanical problem. If the top 20% already have 86%, how are you going to get it away from them without doing redistribution?
Well, the policies we talk about in the book don't involve redistribution. They involve broadening ownership opportunities. And if there are more people that have capital, then that number will go down if you have broader capital ownership. So for example, let's imagine Google was built on the internet. Let's imagine the next 20 technological breakthroughs. Okay, let's imagine an economy with robots. These items, these capital resources, I think should be largely owned by these citizen trust, private market economy corporations to pay dividends. If you can envision the rollout of what we're talking about, you will see that the capital income and capital gains going to the top would go down, not because their property was taken, but because, as the founders talked about, there were broader opportunities for acquisition of property to everyone else. However, I do want to be very clear about this. I do not think that simply broadening ownership in workplaces through profit sharing and employee equity is enough. I think you have to have things like the Alaska Permanent Corporation in addition. But we owe it to our political traditions to at least try these things. That's the best I can answer right now. I'm happy to talk with you more afterwards. Yes?
You just mentioned that you don't think that sort of just employing these like employee stock option things like that would be enough to solve the wealth inequality gap. Have you guys done any like quantitative modeling to see, let's say, what would happen if 100% of the top 5,000 companies adopted this? Like, what would be the impact on wealth inequality, or like how much would it take to actually solve the gap?
Well, the analysis that we've done has to do with who are the employees of these companies. And the problem is that there's a large amount of the U.S. population in the nonprofit government sector. And the second thing is that our tax incentive policies would encourage companies but not force them to implement these plans. So it's likely that people at the lower end of the spectrum might still get lower payments in profit shares and employee ownership. The thing I want to emphasize is that the U.S. government spends, as I said, trillions of dollars every 5 years, over $1 trillion on tax incentives, and many of these incentives incent concentrated capital ownership. We simply want to switch that around, and then we'll see what happens. I will say one thing that is encouraging. In tech, for example, managers with some government support early in the 70s and the 80s spread throughout the tech economy broad-based employee ownership and profit sharing. The Bush administration came in and did some things with the expensing of stock options and not creating a tax incentive for companies that have broad-based stock options after that, kind of destroyed that, okay? Employee ownership has fallen about 75% in tech companies, just so that you know. The Bush administration really hit tech companies hard. So I think we have to see what happens, but we're certainly going to need things like the Alaska Permanent Corporation to really to deal with this. Yes?
I can see how you propose gradually grow wealth, at least among the, say, top 3 quintiles. But we still need political will, right? And you don't really talk about that very much. How do you propose to get the political will to actually make this happen?
Well, in 3 ways. First of all, what is new about our book is that we demonstrate to both conservatives and progressives that there is a strong bipartisan American tradition for broad-based property ownership. For those of the Tea Party, and I've spoken to Tea Party audiences, I will speak to you again and say that yes, low taxes and small government is right there in the founders' writings when you read it. But I also will say that the Tea Party, many of the Tea Party's advocates, forget the third thing in the founders' writings. Broad-based property ownership is necessary for a republic to exist. And in fact, the founders believed, if you read them closely, that it was broad-based property ownership that caused low taxes and small government, because households had enough economic liberty, they didn't need the government enough, and taxes were not needed for transfer payments. So it's a direct challenge to I would say, a dishonest Tea Party reading of American history. Having said that, though, there is an honest Republican, conservative, Tea Party reading of broad-based property ownership that I think will help them support these ideas. And there is an honest approach where broad-based property ownership fits with the social justice interests of conservatives, of progressives. The second approach is that, as I said, and as we show in Chapter 3, there are a lot of companies at all parts of the economy that do this, and we can demonstrate that this is something that can function acceptably. But the third thing really goes back to your question. There really is no other alternative other than redistribution or broadening property ownership. And I think that we have to really get that those are the two alternatives, or simply moving more towards feudalism. If people realize, if our political leaders realize that that's the stark choice, then I think we might get some political will. I certainly hope. If we don't, I think we're going to have a big public fight about this issue every year going forward. Yes?
So I'm in the middle of a book on actually the private equity industry right now.
Right.
And it's sort of interesting the scale of some of these combinations. So if you propose kind of reallocating capital by creating stock plans within individual companies and things like that, how do you ensure that allocation survives like big mergers and acquisitions and those sort of transactions that redefine ownership?
Well, I will say this. A lot of the companies that have broad-based ownership or profit sharing have gone through big mergers. For example, Southwest recently bought AirTran, and they're rolling this out with AirTran. I know Google's constantly acquiring companies and including them in this. Procter & Gamble has spin-offs and acquisitions, but specifically focused on private equity. Consistent with our ideas, the special tax incentive for special capital gains treatment of the profits for private equity partners, in my view, should only be available if they have broad-based share plans in their portfolio companies. That's an example of a tax incentive which violates each of those principles that James Madison laid out, and it has to be turned on its head. There are ways for private equity firms to use broad-based employee ownership and profit sharing when they acquire a portfolio company, and then 4 to 6 years later when they spin it off, they could use an ESOP. So I think this could be relevant to private equity. You are correct that if you look at the stock market, the NASDAQ and the NYSE, I think probably about $17 trillion today. Private equity is already several $1 trillion. So you can't deal with this issue unless you have an approach to private equity. You're absolutely on the button there. Yep. Yes?
You don't really mention, but what would happen if this actually went through in the end? So say, isn't that concern to say businesses reforming the format, having more contract employees to get around the set bylaws instead of hurting and losing healthcare benefits potentially in that regard?
No, I understand. And as you know, Microsoft's part-time employees had a major lawsuit with Microsoft over this issue. It's very clear that in what Professor of Economics at Harvard, Martin Weitzman, called a share economy, that there would be some changes in laws necessary, and employees, even part-time employees and contract employees, would be more cognizant of their rights. I want to go back at the beginning, just for 10 seconds, to the cod fishing story. Remember, Washington's legislation said that every ship that went out had to have a signed contract between the captain of the ship and all the sailors that the captain would obey, a broad-based profit-sharing contract. If you go and look at the local courts in New England, you will see that fights over that contract were a common thing between sailors and shippers at the day. In other words, some kind of legal enforcement mechanism had to emerge. For example, if a sailor got on in Boston and didn't get off at the end of the voyage, but got off in Bangor, Maine, how much of the profit share should he or she get? So I would expect that there would be some legal uptake to deal with the changes that we would have. Other questions? Yes.
How's a share, either ESOP or the Alaska Permanent Corporation, how's a share superior to just a raw amount of money? Like, is it better? Yeah, how is it better than, say, just a 20% bump in salary?
Well, the problem with bumps in salary is that we had a bump in salary economy. I grew up in the mining region of northeastern Pennsylvania. By the way, thank you for coming. I know many of you have to get back to work, and I'll conclude soon. And we used to call it working for the post office. Working for the post office meant that every year your union got you a 3 to 5% real wage increase, and you had a defined benefit pension plan that paid you 70 to 80% of your average of your last 5 income for life. Under the protected economy after World War I, where the United States destroyed all of its enemies and was the dominant power, and we had trade protections around our economy, you remember those days, right? The union workers from AT&T wanted a raise. The union would threaten to strike. AT&T would go to the FCC and get the money and increase your telephone bill, okay? That was before globalization and before deregulation and all of these things. With globalization and deregulation and heightened competition, there isn't as much give in the system to build all wealth through wage increases. So that's one objection. And we have a different context now. We have, as I said, we have globalization. But there's sort of a second reason. The structure of the economy has now changed. So as I've demonstrated with these statistics, most of the wealth is coming. So the incomes, the households that are doing best in the economy are getting that from capital gains and grants of capital ownership. If you own the robots in the future, you're going to get some wealth. And the amount of wage increases, of wealth increases coming from labor income is going down. Whether you look at the Congressional Budget Office or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the percent of labor income in the entire economy is going down, and it keeps dropping every year. And this is another thing that keeps dropping as the internet keeps going. Something is wrong. So that's my response to that. Labor income won't do it alone. Although sure, there clearly are some situations where labor income is unfair. There should be a minimum wage, I think. I disagree with conservatives on this. And I also think that there are some industries where unions have a role to play in terms of getting, fair labor income. But in general, only focusing on labor income is not going to solve the middle class's decline. Are we at 1 o'clock? Okay, well, I want to thank you for coming, and I'll stay around for a few minutes. Thank you so much.